I am very glad to be joined by Jamie Robson, the actor, and well, I'll say how we met shortly. But Jamie, hi, nice to see you.
Hello, Mark.
We actually met through the work of Rupert Spira.
Yeah.
We've both been sort of following what he does and had conversations with him as well.
Mhm.
And for those unfamiliar with this star in our universe. He is a British artist and teacher of Advaita Vedanta, but in a very sort of, I don't know, flexible, direct, and to my mind, really relatable way, put it like that. But look, I
Mhm.
mean, how did you come across his work, and is it related to acting at all? And how start to help me understand how these things come together.
Yeah, I struggle to remember how I initially came across Rupert's work. I'd always had an interest in sort of spiritual disciplines right back to childhood. And I've had this conversation before, I've spoken about this before, but um, as I navigated my way through different spiritual disciplines, different forms of meditation, different mind-body practices from different cultures and different times, nothing quite seemed to be what I was looking for. Nothing seemed to sort of address the things that I wanted to. So it was a chance encounter that led me to acting, and then I sort of realized that acting was this process that was going to help me explore these various landscapes that I wanted to. But then around the same time as getting into acting, I started to learn more about non-duality. And in particular derivatives of it, such as Advaita Vedanta, and more, and also like Western examples such as the Christian mystics and Sufism and so on, and the kind of non-dual thread that runs through the core of these disciplines. And I think it was just a book in a shop that I picked up, and the simplicity but the depth of language that Rupert uses, his pointers are so effective, and it's sort of free of cultural baggage, that it's accessible for anyone, and you can mold it or shape it to your needs. So yeah, and then I started to read more of his books, and we started to correspond, and we built a friendship, and that's when we met at the park, the event. So
Yeah, no, that was a very telling moment for me actually, because I'd been following Rupert, and then I had a couple of conversations with him online where I really wanted to try and understand a bit more how the way that he teaches relates particularly to Christian mysticism, as that is
mm,
my sort of spiritual first language.
right,
I mean, just in parenthesis, between ourselves, it was very nice meeting him in person actually, because I was a bit nervous. Sometimes, when you meet
right,
people that you're slightly,
admire or
overwhelmed
whatever.
by,
Yeah,
it's a bit, well, not so much disappointing, but it can be a bit unsettling. But he's very much the same person in life as he
yeah,
is on the screen or whatever. So it was a very
yeah,
lovely experience actually. And then meeting you
yeah,
as well, having listened to you talk to him before. Um, but yeah, that
yeah.
I think what he did for me was help me own just that little bit more, particularly the Christian mystical tradition. I mean, I've worked quite a lot on figures like Dante, currently working a lot on
Mm.
William Blake, and
Mhm.
well, actually, Rupert will often cite William Blake, but
Breakfast Blake. Yeah.
yeah. But I think that sort of the clarity that he brings to the sense that at the heart of us and at the heart of others and at the heart of everything is the still point in a turning world, is being itself, is the presence of awareness. The way that he can help evoke that is very, very powerful. But I kind of wanted to ask you a bit and maybe help explore myself where you personally have taken that. Because in some ways, Rupert's approach is quite stark, actually. It's very pared down, very focused. And I think that has this enormous value, that it helps people to get in direct touch with the core, with God, which he'll use as well when he's in more theistic mood. But as he often says, that's just chapter one, and there's lots of chapters to follow, and how one then returns to life almost, or lives day by day, is like a whole other question entirely. I mean, is that something you've given thought to?
Yes, I mean, it certainly helps that his background was an artist, a sculptor or a potter, that certainly helps his ability to often translate conscious orientated or spiritual language into creative, language. It's to weave the two paths together. But as you say, that simplicity that still retains a depth. I mean, when I think about the craft of acting, it's very much about distilling the process into almost like a bullet point list that I can, if I forget, they function as pointers, and so much so that I'll sometimes, if I can't find a word that encompasses what I'm trying to reference as a reminder, that there's not a word that seems to encompass what I need, I'll just make up words, like the idea of feeling my way through a scene or feeling my way through a conversation, and using that, as a means of navigating my way through the script, through the material, through the scene. So I come up with a word like feeligation, so I'll combining feeling and navigation, feeligation, I'll feel my way through. I think Rupert's, one of the words that Rupert uses again and again is this term being, and I guess if I was to summarize acting, for me, it's a careful balance between being and doing, being be this sort of this surrendering process of vulnerability where you're not acting, you're very much naked, in the sense where doing is when there's a technical craft, there's a performance, there's a sort of there's a thinking rather than a feeling, So, yeah, arguably, or for me, acting ultimately is a careful balance between being and doing, and then that breaks down into various subdivisions or sub points or things to remember. And I actually try to break the practical application of being into bullet points, which sounds a bit mechanical or a bit intellectual, but it does help sometimes to have these key pointers so you remember how to get back into that state, because there's somewhat of a correlation with the term flow state, and there is a term, the creative state, that certain acting coaches or directors, particularly of the sort of 20th and 19th century, you'd use the state that an actor should be in, and there's more contemporary terms like the flow state with regards to athletes, and there's some it's synonymous to a certain extent. There is some, similarities there. So,
Have you got an example of a bullet point in mind? That's very fascinating. I mean, it reminds me a bit of some of Rupert Spira's sort of orientating questions, like on
yes,
whose behalf is this feeling arising? That
correct.
helps you to
Yes,
both sort of have the feeling, but also do that inner step back from the feeling, and then discover more that lies behind, and then that which supports your being, actually, which isn't attached to the feeling. The feeling is a sort of a passing or transient moment over the top of that being. So are the bullet points a bit like that, or have you got did one
yes.
come
Well,
to?
I mean, yes, that's interesting in itself that you sort of distilled the different layers of, thinking perhaps at the most superficial, sinking deeper into a state of feeling, but then transcending that into being, which is, touching it into the realm of the ineffable. So that's interesting, and I agree. But one example would be uh, a word like spontaneousing. Again, and it's the idea that not to find yourself preparing or reconstructing or adjusting yourself prior to a moment, a scene, a transition, an interaction, but to be completely open, a sort of, to represent this yesing, this sort of felt yesing where, however the scene goes, whatever your scene partner provides or does, whatever comes up in you, or if you find yourself on a break between setups and, you're back into mundane mindset, having your coffee or reading a book, and suddenly you're called into a scene, not to feel this compulsion to sort of adjust, check, clear your throat, worry that you're not in the right zone, but just to seamlessly transition from one experience to the next. For me, that's key. And actually, in daily life as well, if you're walking along the street in your own thoughts and you bump into someone, you can sometimes feel a sort of, oh, I'm not ready. I've been caught off guard. I'm not in the right state of mind for this interaction, for this conversation. So you're constantly impeding that spontaneity to just, experience one thing to the next. Like I said, to slide, to transition seamlessly between one experience to the next. So that's one, the spontaneous thing. It's really the first. It's the first, because everything else happens after that. If somebody says, Jamie, we're ready for you now, can you come on set? Or you're on set and you're waiting for the camera to be adjusted, or you're waiting for a light to be adjusted. And then someone says, in your own time, action or whatever, that that spontaneous thing, that yes, that openness, that not thinking that you need to be anything different from what you are now. You don't need to check your hair. You don't need to clear your throat. You don't need to quickly read over your lines. You don't need to change the state of mind that you're in, because for me, acting that can have a powerful effect is much more like a documentary. You're capturing someone having an experience and engaging in conversation. You're trying to influence someone else, trying to achieve something, and it's less about a performance and it's more about documenting. It's like safari. You're just documenting animals in their natural habitat, and for me, that's one example, spontaneous thing. And
I like the
another
analogism.
might be one more might be, for example, green lighting. So, I like that there. Like I got a sudden impulse to just reinforce the point with another example. And similarly, if you're in a scene and there's a feeling comes up, and you can sometimes feel unsure if it's right or if it's enough or what is it, but just to green light that impulse, and to not to second guess or not to overanalyze things before they come out, but to green light impulses. And
Yeah, I tell you what.
you know,
Maybe I feel like I'm sort of getting what you're saying, but I tell you what's slightly coming into my mind as well. Um, and again, just to reference Rupert one more time, is one of his favourite analogies is to talk about King Lear and John Smith, and the idea is that John Smith is the actor, and then of course King Lear is the part,
yes,
and how if, as John Smith, he gets caught up too much in the role of King Lear, he might forget that he's not the king of England at war with France and all that, and so has to recover the sense of his true identity. And then the analog, of course,
yes,
is discovering who we truly are, rather than the parts that we play. So if I put it like
yes.
that, you're talking about something different from that. Then you're not talking about switching from one part to another. There's something more subtle going on in what you're saying, is there?
In a way, what they are descriptions of qualities that you should notice either in the moment or in retrospect of being. If you want to describe someone or yourself either from the moment or retrospectively, these bullet points should they should encompass the qualities, the characteristics of being. So if you're resting as being, then it's like a universal yes. And to quote Rupert or his one of his teachers, meditation is a universal yes. That's not an intellectual thing. Obviously, it can be a practical pointer or cue, but you can also observe it in yourself. So it's almost reverse engineering sometimes, where I've highlighted key traits or characteristics or qualities that you recognize in being, such as feeligation. The fact that when you're rested as being, it's an intuitive process. This is sort of more of the Iain McGilchrist right hemisphere stuff, where you're not driven by superficial thought. There's something deeper guiding you, and that's what pulls you through a scene or an experience. So they're basically a list of qualities that I notice in being that can also be used to get into being if I'm struggling. And they're sort of reminders, and they're yeah, that's so with regards to the King Lear John Smith analogy, it would be these bullet points would be descriptions of the qualities if you were to observe John Smith. How would you observe John Smith's behavior? How would you observe John Smith if he was in this room, if you were in correspondence with him, if you're observing him? Um, uh, and I know there's a contradiction there, because ultimately being John Smith and what we're talking about is somewhat ineffable, and poetry is perhaps the best you can do. But these pointers are somewhat poetic. They're words often that I've made up. They have different layers of depth of interpretation. They're, for me, I wouldn't necessarily give them or suggest other people use them. But yeah, they're a strange hybrid where they're reverse engineered observations, they're pointers to get there, they're poetic labels, so I can maybe after a scene that I wasn't quite happy with, I realized there's a certain ingredient missing. So but the
Hmm.
John Smith King Lear is a great analogy.
I tell you what, now I'm sort of pondering all this a bit more. I'm wondering if actually you're touching on something which I feel is really important in all this teaching, and by that I mean sort of non-dual teaching. I actually get it as much from, say, Meister Eckhart, who again Rupert
Yes.
will often cite. But it's very striking that in a Meister Eckhart sermon, he will start off with you need to turn away from all creative things, all transient things, all things of the soul, all passions, all powers. And you think, my goodness, this is like seriously ascetic, seriously kind of stark.
Yeah.
And then he'll say, and it's only in the stillness that you will find the God who comes, being, again, the words are used differently, but that central grounding and that one real thing. And you think, okay, so, but what about in the Christian context, say, good works? And Meister Eckhart, sometimes he does dialogues in his sermons, and he says, someone will say to me, but what about virtues, or what about charity? And I will say to you, no, you don't need that. Stillness is all you need. And you think, oh my goodness, it feels like a hell of a lot's being chucked away here.
Very Taoist.
But then what he says is, but then again, in the sort of Q&A form, sometimes someone will say, but how will I know when I found this stillness? How will I know when I found this ground? And then Meister Eckhart says, because God must come back. And he's quite sort of fierce about that. And he says, the whole world now will look to you differently. And although those good works, the virtues, the charity, all those created things, all those things which in one moment you turned your back on, they are now seen, but they're seen afresh, and they're seen as myriad reflections of the divine light. They're seen as many fragments of the one, if you like. So you see them truly, and it's that sort of to and fro that I feel is really important to remember. It's not a kind of puritanical stripping away of all things until you get to this clear kind of stillness. That's just the sort of first moment. Then into that clearness, Meister Eckhart would say, God rushes back. And then you're living life, perhaps in a way, seemingly exactly the same life, but the perception of that life is utterly different because, and this is, what I'm wondering if you're saying, because it's a bit like acting from the place of being rather than from some sort of more frantic, fragmented, determined kind of space.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Eckhart, Meister Eckhart is when he talks about the ground of being, and this idea that it's only in retrospect, once you are established there, either presumably when you come out into more mundane existence, you see these qualities as a result of being. It's but they can also be paths back in. That's the thing for me. That they're not they're observations when you come out of being, when you have to have some element of doing, but also when you want to go back to being, these can be channels. The qualities of being, the rivers that flow from being can be used to trace your way back from doing. There's a two-way, and I think that practical aspect is very important for me, because in the early days I'd have these tastes of I mean, Lord Meister Eckhart, terms like surrender or
Detachment would
this
be
sort
another
of,
big one for him. Yeah.
it's apophatic to a certain extent, and even the Sufi writers such as Ibn Arabi or Rumi, of course, descending into ever widening rings of being. Like some of that poetry or literature has such an intense practical quality to it. It doesn't, to descend, when you embody that word into ever widening rings of being, For me, there's a huge body, physical, felt quality to this. And I believe, for example, whirling in its earliest form, would have been much more spontaneous, and it was a sort of, the three obstacles to being, the mind, the body, and the world. When I mean, Rupert, for example, talks about it in what he calls the yoga meditations, which I'm sure maybe he wishes he'd used a different title now, because they may be confused with asanas and yoga as it's known. But this idea that not only the mind must be surrendered, but the body too has to be, you're not in your body is in you. And acting's very physical, so this idea that there's an unwinding process where the body, the mind, and indeed the world is you sort of, again, descend into ever, let go, surrender into ever widening rings of being. It's something that can be felt, and then from that, you're in a better state. You're closer to what we're discussing. So the physical element is very important. And when I studied various Eastern practices like Qigong and met Sufi practitioners, it really struck me how the mind and the body, just, they're one. And the process that we've just discussed, and the process we're both interested in, is very much, they're two halves. Uh,
Yeah,
uh,
I'm sure
uh,
that's right. I'm sure that's right. Yes, yeah. Um, I mean, maybe another sort of swing by this I don't know, this sense is to think. I like what you said there about how maybe the phrases you have or the embodied experiences are ways back as well as arising from, and it made me think about like Blake will talk about minute particulars. So it's to see the world in a grain of sand, or heaven in a wild flower. And so the linking of the very specific with the ground of that specificity is very clear in Blake.
mhm,
And I find that a very helpful um, way too of both finding the way back as well as getting the sense of what this might all be arising
mhm,
from too. I heard it explained the other day. You mentioned Iain McGilchrist, and he's famous now for his brain lateralization thesis, and this sense of that we have two perceptual capacities that need to be in some sort of relationship, proper relationship, in order
mhm,
for a fuller consciousness. It's talked about in different forms, but I feel like there's a relationship here, perhaps with the two ways that spiritual practice is sometimes taught, because there is one mode, one moment when it is quite a paring down. So, for example, at one point I did quite a lengthy mindfulness meditation training, and there was a sort of paring down approach. So, you maybe use the breath as a support, a sort of minimal support that enabled that more expansive sense of things to develop. And I particularly like walking, actually. So walking meditation, just that sense of your feet on the ground and so on, um, is a kind of minimal approach in order to cultivate that awareness. And that's one moment. But I think in this sort of two senses that we have, two ways we have of perceiving things, there is another way, which is actually to move into the manifold experience, but with the intention of seeing the one behind the many. And in spiritual practices, I don't know, saying a rosary or the use of beads, beads are used in Sufi traditions, of course, as well, and Hindu and others. And there it's like you are doing something and it's embodied, in this case particularly. But it's with a kind of intention of seeing through that which you're doing. If it's a mantra or
mhm,
using words, it's like moving to the edge of the words in order that that place from which the words arise comes. That thought has helped me actually to realize that there can be, well, I think there are two modes that you find in different spiritual practices. And actually, they are complementary at the end of the day, because one might be a practice for the ground, the other might be a practice for seeing the ground in all things. Put it like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I mean, to go back to the start of what you said, you could force a synonymous sort of attitude on Iain McGilchrist's left and right hemisphere, with the right representing being and the left representing doing. And this, like, he talks often about this transition from thinking to feeling. I mean, obviously, it's not as dualistic or simple as that. There's crossovers. It's not as, he's always trying to correct this sort of simplification of the distinction, but a lot of the things that he suggests, such as walking in nature or music, which can be a physical experience, and meditation and various physical pursuits, reading poetry, and what you described there, this idea of, it is an enchantment in the sense that you're starting to see depth in everything, and layers of meaning, with deeper ones to be discovered. That is a very poetic model, in the sense that looking at something relatively simple, like a breath-based practice, of course, the breath itself is incredibly profound. There's a lot of metaphors there. Like, I used to train with sort of Russian breath masters, and they'd use terms like, let the exhale make you cleaner, where you sort of associate that you no longer need, no longer want, with the out breath. But then you contemplate, well, where is that going, and what is that is able to receive that which I'm unable to process on my own. So yeah, that sort of simple profundity, or that ability to have something that's perceived as simple, but actually, and that's that is it makes the world a much more interesting place when you have that perspective, that ability to look at anything and see history or meaning, or different interpretations, and that's a fascinating and very poetic way to look on the world. So I totally agree that the two ends of the spectrum are complement.
Now, look, you mentioned the word enchantment there, and when we were talking earlier,
Yeah.
we wondered whether this might be something which we would touch on. And in one way, going to enchantment might feel like a shift of gear, because enchantment often feels like it's to do with the many, not the one. It's seeing the life in all things, maybe being aware of other entities, angels at the sort of highbrow end of the spectrum, maybe fairies and all sorts of other things at the lower end, or the more immediate common and garden end. And we also were wondering whether we might touch on even things like UFOs as forms of modern enchantment. And I suppose, to sort of cut to the chase, my fascination with these things, both what feels like the kind of experiences that people in bygone generations would have experienced more directly, so again, like William Blake, he lived with entities like angels every day, I think, pretty much, more or less continually. And then maybe in the modern world, where we're not so good at this kind of open consciousness, which is where I think enchantment really comes from. And so people have these strange experiences with UFOs or whatever. That's a quick indicator of how I understand that latter phenomena. But I'm very influenced by a chap called Owen Barfield, and he talks a lot about how consciousness itself changes. It's not just that within, as it were, one worldview or mindset, we accumulate awareness, knowledge, sense of things, and so on. But that actually the mindset, the worldview itself changes, and that opens up the sense of certain things, but can also close down the sense of other things. And so he would say that enchantment used to come from the fact that people experienced the world as, well, what we would now call symbol. That everything, it wasn't just the foreground appearance that was felt to be present, but the background or the inner core, the source was felt to be present in all things as well. And sometimes that would have been conceived, imagined as some kind of entity, perhaps the spirit of a place, maybe the dwelling of the copse of trees. The meaning of the stars in the sky would be different, and then there were the more ineffable experiences as well, the presence of numinosity or the apophatic. But what's happened in the modern world is that sense of being able to see things as symbols spontaneously without thinking, oh, that's a symbol, now I need to interpret it. Spontaneously feeling the background, the interiority of things. We have become uncoupled from that, and we are much more inclined to presume that seeing something is about seeing it as a subject looking onto an object, and hence the phrase sort of I-it relationships rather than I-thou, or even I, which Martin Buber also used to say. And that there's an advantage in that because, we do value the individual, and there's been a lot of gains from valuing the individual, and not just seeing everything as part of a greater whole. But nonetheless, I feel like the teachings within the non-dual world, maybe there'll be a time, maybe the time is coming now, where there'll be a sort of nudge back towards re-enchanting the world from the basis of the non-dual understanding, so that one can both have a sense of the ground within in oneself, but also the ground within all things, thrown up in diverse ways, that might be experienced again as a kind of re-enchantment, when things are seen as speaking, singing, chorusing to the one in their many forms, and then not just as perhaps people are more inclined to now, as just a whole bunch of objects in the world that we're not quite sure how we are supposed to relate to. Enchantment. That was quite a long bit of spiel from me, but enchantment. What fascinates you about it?
Yeah, well, I agree with all of what you've said, and I'm equally interested in all of what you've touched upon. In a way, what you described at the end there is acting. Acting is this idea of me, on them. That there is a sense of self, but good acting is basically a turning away from that, or certainly a bridging from that onto the other. Not just the other actor, but the scene itself, what's going on, the energy, the atmosphere. And of course, that is a good way to interact with society, this idea of me, on them. To, a lot of things like social anxiety are caused by an excessively inward focus, and all these tiny energies that you have become magnified. Whereas by simply just putting your awareness, putting your attention, attendari, to go towards, on the other person, that is the building blocks for correspondence, for communication. And perhaps in society now, where there's a drive that supports more and more narcissism, that basic early stage requirement of me, on them is increasingly missing. But when you talk about enchantment or re-enchantment, we'll have fun when we go into the more metaphysical or mysterious layers of it. But even on a more day-to-day or mundane level, if you walk past I walked past a stone pillar near where I live last week, and for whatever reason, I was in a state of mind. I was in an enchanted state of mind where I saw the pillar realized, oh, it's an old gate pillar. There must have been a gate here at some point on this close. Oh, it's a Georgian pillar, but there's a sort of older section, and that section sort of Greek flutes, columns. And it's almost like a sort of psychedelic experience, because you suddenly see different periods in history, different architectural influences, different practical uses, different eras of the weather that's affected it, where the older part had soot stains and the newer part less so. But because it was not hit by the light, the lower part had moss. I mean, you could look at the one thing in that enchanted lens, and it makes you're like swimming in meaning. You turn around and see one thing. Someone built that of a particular era, and that era was influenced by another classical age, and that classical. And it's, if you're just open to that depth referencing, and it obviously not just architecture. It could be nature. It could be music. It could be people. I think it's a real shame that when we stick to that superficial, you just see something and take it for what it is, and fail to realize, who that is, what it is, who created it, why, how, and all the various influences. That alone is a wonderful way to walk through the world.
Yeah, it
It's
feels
almost
like you're
like
describing almost, with that example at least, the kind of re-enchantment of time, whereas I was maybe talking in that case more re-enchantment of space.
yes,
You're seeing many facets of time presencing themselves, and
yes.
so
Well, I mean, if you see let's say a pre-enlightenment, perspective of a forest, let's say a traditional oak forest, um, they were often seen by certain cultures as a representation of the subconscious, that they were dark places where the shadows allowed the imagination to run, and they were places of shelter, places of forage. They provided materials. They were treated with a sort of respect, and whereas when if you're a disenchanted culture, will just see it as a bunch of sticks to be chopped down and turned into paper, and that's it. And it's that's why I think a re-enchantment, certainly, as we say, in this kind of more nuts and bolts level, but equally is you can find yourself, because yeah, the other end of the spectrum, as you discussed, it is interesting right now that we have so much things about extraterrestrial life or UFOs or UAPs in the news. And you think of Jung's book on the subject and his interpretation of what it was, the sort of geo archetypes or metaphors, or that people. Have you ever heard of Diana Pasulka?
I haven't. No.
Yeah, she has an interesting interpretation on things, and she's I think she's a PhD doctor of I think it's either history or theology or both, but she's started to study the phenomenon now, and yeah, it's very interesting. It's almost like this
Oh
sort of
no, wait a minute.
innate need.
Did she write the book American Cosmic?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I've read the book. I just forgotten her name. I've read the book. Yeah, I
Yeah,
very much enjoyed it.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Uh huh. Well, because she is an anthropologist of religion, and so
Yeah.
uses those patterns to interpret the UFO phenomena. No, and I did find that very, very interesting. And I like the way that she stays in a space where there's a possibility for re-enchantment, actually. I mean, she doesn't put it quite like that, but she doesn't want to just do the rather scientific approach and ask, is it or isn't it happening? Because that just shuts down the richness of the phenomena. But rather
Yeah.
assume that it is and ask what that might be telling us about our times. And actually, I read another book quite recently about levitation, and another
Right.
academic who's written a book. It's called They Flew, and it looks particularly at three kind of stars of levitation in the Christian tradition. One is Teresa of Avila, the other is John of Cupertino, and there's a third as well. I think her name is Marguerite of Avida. And what he says is, look, this strange experience of these saints levitating is enormously well attested, and moreover pretty thoroughly investigated, because the Inquisition wanted to know what was going on, but not so as to ask, is this happening, but why is this happening? And the sort of slightly noddy way of reducing their question why is, was it of God or was it of the devil? But what really struck me about this levitation was, well, for one thing, Teresa of Avila, what's very fascinating about her is she discusses what's going on pretty extensively in her autobiography. And she's very smart. Well, she's now a doctor of the church. And so it's very interesting. And she talks in one way, she has a sort of explanation, which is that, and it relates to your embodied comment, actually, that in a moment of ecstasy, her body follows her inner movement, her soul. And I guess that in the early modern world in which she lived, because there was still a sense that rising to God meant literally rising to God. So therefore, she says, my body would be, as it were, dragged behind the energy that was in my soul and its movement to God. Now, that doesn't explain it, of course, in anything like physical terms now, but nonetheless, maybe if we're talking about a kind of shift of consciousness, a shift of awareness, where you're as alert to the inner movement of something or someone as the purely external, you don't just see the surface, but you see the inner as well, then maybe in that world where people had this slightly wider perception, things like levitation would still be exceptional and associated with saints or with something more demonic, but nonetheless the surprise wasn't that it happened at all. The surprise was, why is it happening? And I just wonder whether there's some kind of parallel explanation for UFOs now, that what we're seeing, and this is quite a Jungian point, actually, it's not new, but what people who have these UFO experiences are seeing is something that's as much about the inside of the cosmos as it is about just objects in the cosmos. But we haven't quite got the language and therefore the way of interpreting or understanding what's going on yet, because we need something more re-enchanted.
Yeah, well, I mean, 2 points there that you said. One may take us off at another tangent, but that's okay. But to stick with this subject for now, back to Iain McGilchrist, it could be that, pre-industrial revolution, pre the disenchantment of society, that we were more established more often in a right hemisphere dominance, much more open, less empirical, less compartmentalizing, less small details orientated, and that the number of certain experiences was because society at large was more right hemisphere orientated, where perhaps after the Industrial Revolution and beyond, we're tend to be more left dominant. Again, it's not as black and white as that. Iain would
Yeah. No, but
correct.
just for the sake
But
of Yeah.
Yeah, and that certainly is because people that often have these experiences, whether they're tangible, or metaphorical, or that strange, interesting space between the two that you touched upon. It's preceded by a certain state. Even in more contemporary examples, someone may be driving, and driving is known to sometimes induce the flow state because you're tasked with a basic activity, but it's a very crude analogy for the flow state is to be relaxed and focused at the same time, to have a task that you're able to do in autopilot, but to have this sort of this sort of relaxation is squeezed onto something, and so that's very interesting. And I think regardless of the more fantastical or unbelievable examples, I think, as it'd be nice to see a culture society incorporate more disciplines or practices or that were supportive of the right hemisphere, of that state of being, where enchantment is a sort of natural byproduct. I think enchantment maybe perhaps is a result of being, a sliding scale, of course, but
Yeah.
bear that
Hey,
in
look,
mind.
I like that phrase you use there, just a natural byproduct, because I think that's really important. Because another thing that Teresa of Avila and other great teachers will tell you is that you shouldn't get too fixated on the strange things. They are themselves a byproduct of seeing something in more depth. And in fact, if you do get too hooked on the
Exactly.
strangeness, then you lose the depth. And that's the great risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Hey,
And
look, you mentioned a culture there. Um, can I just ask you about this movement in film which you're associated with, which is the British weird wave, I think is the expression. And has this got anything to do with that?
yes, it certainly could. I mean, I was going to finish off there that there's even examples in Eastern traditions with Zen where they meditating pointers where they'd say even if the Buddha himself appears in front of you, strike him down. There's analogies at that about not getting too attached to the bells and whistles of the process. But yeah, the weird wave. In a way, it ties into what I was going to talk about. Something you mentioned about the why, and I feel that the why, pursuing the why and trying to understand the why, is often just as valuable, if not more, than pursuing the how or trying to understand the how. For example, from an acting perspective, you don't want to try and overly plan how you'll do a scene. I'll hold the glass at this point. At that word, I'll turn. I'll then react this way. That becomes very performative, very representative, and yeah, it's not what you do in real life. In real life, even if you had a rough plan, like there's a colleague that I'm not happy with, there's a situation that needs to be addressed. You have a rough plan of when you're going to speak to them and how you're going to approach the subject, but you don't okay, I'm gonna frown to look very serious, and I'm gonna roll up my sleeves, and at this certain word, you don't plan, you don't obsess over the how as much in real life as perhaps people think, because you understand the why. If you understand the why, the how naturally bubbles forth. It's obvious. It takes care of itself. It's spontaneous and it's obvious if you understand the why. Why am I not happy with this colleague? Why must I resolve this situation? Why must I right this wrong? And I think I find that very liberating, because it frees you to be natural and spontaneous in a scene, and to have rough boundaries and perimeters, but to really embody the why. Then every take can be different, every night can be different, and the how is based on what's happening right now. You're not bringing it into the situation. You're not forcing it into the situation. You're reacting to what they say, what they do, what you feel, and these hows that come out in the moment are all established in a deep understanding of the why. So the weird wave it just happened to be a period when around the time I started acting, I was collaborating with a lot of interesting new filmmakers, people like Peter Marsden, Charlotte Wells, Ross Wilson, and there were other filmmakers such as Mark Jenkin, who were sort of associated with this term, the weird wave, where there were low budget sort of alternative films that were rich in ambiguity, and they were a reaction to the time. It was post Brexit. It was the Trump era. There wasn't a lot of money for new filmmakers. It was very difficult to get finance in the UK for new filmmakers, and people started making films off their own back with their own money, low budget, very shoestring, and they, instead of trying to squeeze a classical arc or a classical narrative or structure, they were very spacious and ambiguous, and some of them did very well. They went to big festivals or were seen by big critics, or some of them went on to be big successes, like Mark Jenkin or Charlotte Wells. Obviously, she's a big, so and those films are the why. They're not trying to force a particular narrative. They're not trying to raise a particular agenda. They're a space for the imagination to flourish. There's a Russian filmmaking technique called the Kuleshov effect, and basically it's when you have, say, a shot of someone's face that's neutral, blank face, and then you cut to something like an attractive opposite sex, or a sumptuous looking meal, or a cute dog, or whatever, or a dead person, and then you'll cut back to this blank, supposedly neutral face, and you'll swear blind that the face has changed, that now you'll read. And it's because you're superimposing your interpretation, your response to these scenes onto this blank canvas of the face, which is such a profound thing. It says so much about what acting can be, the participation of the audience, that your participation in the world, your plays as much a role as what's coming at you. So this sort of ties in our whole conversation to date. The weird wave, I don't know if it still exists. I don't know if people will still use it, but I mean, it's an interesting term. And there's other weird waves. There's been a weird wave in Greece. I think famously the Greek weird wave was very well known, well established. And to a certain extent in the past, Iranian cinema, people like Abbas Kiarostami, they had a similar approach to filmmaking, and it's nice to be associated with a few of those projects. I've been in them, so.
Yeah, and it's very fascinating. I mean, I love it when cultural forms of one sort or another take us out of, well, on the one hand, kind of what you expect. Implicitly the familiar forms, but if they also open up to link back to what we've been saying, to a more enchanted sense of things, whether that be the sense of one awareness of what oneself brings to an act of perception, that then can be a step to perceiving something deeper or wholly other even. I very much value that kind of,
Sorry, just that back to, yes, I mean, that's what cinema did for me. I mean, film, at some point early on, I realized that film is one of the newest art forms. But what's unique about it, or certainly interesting, is that it contains all of the predecessors. So good dialogue is like poetry, good scripts are literature, the blocking and the mise en scene, the movement of the actors is like dance, the cinematography is like painting, the score, the composing, the music, all the art forms are there. And that, in a way, when you realize that, when you look at a piece of quality filmmaking and you realize that everything has been put, that cup is there, somebody put that cup there, somebody chose to that color for that sofa, and that word has been mulled over in countless drafts, and countless takes subsequently. That's again like the gatepost, the pillar that I saw. That's you realize that there's so much depth of meaning and history and different art forms that all come in to make this one scene, this one shot. And that is in a way an enchantment or a re-enchantment. And it made me then almost put myself through a self initiated study of the humanities, realizing music, literature, poetry, sculpture, that all the different art forms. A better grasp of those will only contribute to being a better member of the film industry, and it's very interesting.
No, for sure. Hey, look, we'll draw to a close for this conversation, having ranged over a few matters. We thought we might try to weave them together, but thank you for, I think, particularly stretching the kinds of things that I otherwise habitually think, by particularly relating it to the sense of what acting involves. That for me is a very suggestive, imaginative exercise, actually, to try and open up how to live, day by day, what otherwise one tries to foster in dedicated practices. And I particularly, I don't know, there's a number of things you said, but one thing, the way back as much as the way from. And I'm going to try and see whether any neologisms spontaneously arise to me as well, because I can see how if you get a word that's come from somehow your soul, to hold on to that, it can be very valuable for helping maintain that sense of different awareness. So look, Jamie, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I've thoroughly enjoyed your company. I'm actually reading one of your books right now, and it's very, very interesting. And I've followed your podcast for a while. It's fascinating. It's very beneficial. So I'm very grateful of what you do and grateful for your time.
Hey, look, thank you. Thanks for the plug. And people can find out more about you very easily online as well. JamieRobson.com would be one place, but there'll be others too. So if you've enjoyed the conversation, do look these things up. But thanks for now, Jamie.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. Goodbye.